Clara had worked as a maid all her life. She knew what it meant to clean silently, to move without being noticed, and to leave before anyone remembered her name. Life hadn't been kind to her, but she never complained. Her main focus was her daughter, Lena, a 16-year-old girl who was bright, kind, and full of dreams much bigger than their small rented room in the city. When Clara got the job at the Reynolds mansion, she saw it as a blessing. The Reynolds family was one of the richest families in the city. The huge white mansion stood at the top of a hill, with shining glass windows and a long driveway lined with flowers. To Clara, it felt like a different world. Clean, quiet, and far away from the noise of the neighborhood where she lived. Every morning, she would take 2 buses to reach the mansion, while Lena walked beside her until they reached the gate. The guards already knew them by face. The tired but polite maid and her curious daughter who always carried a small notebook and a pen. Lena would wait in the staff lounge or sometimes in the garden, studying or helping her mother fold laundry after school. The Reynolds family was not unkind, but they were distant. Mr. Arthur Reynolds, the billionaire himself, was a man who barely smiled. His life was always about business meetings, phone calls, and charity events. His wife, Madeline, was elegant but cold. She liked perfection. Everything spotless, quiet, and done her way. To her, the staff existed to serve, not to talk. Clara accepted that silently. She worked hard, polishing floors until they shone, dusting the large furniture, washing the fine china carefully as if touching gold. She often told Lena, "We might be poor, but we must do our work with respect. Never forget that." Lena nodded, always observing the people around her. She noticed something most of the others ignored, an old woman who sat quietly by the window on the upper floor. She had white hair, kind eyes, and a face that looked lonely even when people passed by her. That was Mrs. Margaret Reynolds, Arthur's mother. No one really talked to her. Some of the staff whispered that she was deaf, that she couldn't hear or speak properly. Others said she had been this way for years and rarely left her room. Lena would sometimes see her staring at the garden from her wheelchair, her hands resting quietly in her lap. There was something about her, a mix of sadness and calm, that drew Lena's attention. One day, while Clara was mopping the hallway, Madeline came by, inspecting the rooms as usual. "Be careful with the curtains," she said sharply. "They're imported from Italy. If you damage them, it will come out of your salary." Clara quickly nodded and smiled politely, though her hands trembled slightly. Lena watched quietly from the corner, feeling a mix of pride and worry for her mother. When the cleaning was done, Clara went to the kitchen for a short break. Lena sat by the window, looking out at the mansion's garden, wondering how it must feel to live in such a place, to not worry about rent, food, or the next month's bills. But she also noticed something strange. Even with all this wealth, the house didn't feel happy. The workers spoke in hushed voices, the family rarely smiled, and the air always felt heavy. Later that afternoon, while Clara was sweeping near the library, Lena saw the old lady again. Margaret was sitting alone near the window, the sunlight touching her silver hair. A tray of tea sat untouched on the table beside her. A few maids passed by but none said a word to her. It was as if she wasn't there. Lena felt something stir inside her, a mix of sadness and curiosity. She wanted to go to her, to say hello, but she hesitated. She didn't want to cause trouble for her mother. She quietly asked one of the maids, "Why does no one talk to her?" The maid shrugged. "She can't hear us, dear. The old lady's deaf. It's useless trying." Then she hurried away. That night, when they went home, Lena couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. "Mama," she asked, "doesn't anyone try to talk to her? Maybe she feels lonely." Clara sighed. "Child, rich people have their own ways. Maybe she doesn't want to talk. You mustn't get involved, okay? Just stay out of trouble." But Lena couldn't forget the image of the old woman sitting alone, staring at nothing. There was something in her eyes, something that reminded Lena of her own grandmother, who used to smile even when life was hard. The next morning, Clara and Lena returned to the mansion as usual. The day was busy. Guests were expected, and everyone rushed to make the house perfect. Clara was assigned to clean the dining hall, and Lena sat quietly near the back garden, flipping through her notebook. Then she looked up and saw Margaret again, sitting by the roses, a blanket over her knees. This time there was no one around. The wind moved softly through the flowers, and the old woman seemed to be talking to herself in silence, moving her hands slowly, almost like drawing shapes in the air. Lena's eyes widened. She recognized those movements. It was sign language. Her heart began to beat faster. Without thinking, she stood up and slowly walked toward the old woman. Margaret turned her head, her eyes gentle but curious. And in that quiet garden, for the first time, someone looked at her not with pity, but with understanding. Lena smiled and raised her hands to sign a simple message she had learned long ago. "Good morning. How are you?" Margaret froze for a second. Then her face lit up with surprise and joy. She signed back quickly, her hands trembling slightly. "You can sign." Lena nodded. And in that small, magical moment, the walls of silence that had surrounded the mansion for years began to fall. All because of a maid's daughter who cared enough to listen with her heart. The big Reynolds mansion was full of noise. People talking, footsteps echoing, phones ringing, and doors opening and closing all day. But in one corner of that house, there was a deep silence. That silence belonged to Margaret Reynolds, the old mother of billionaire Arthur Reynolds. Margaret had once been full of life. In her younger days, she loved music, parties, and laughter. She was kind to everyone, the type of woman who remembered every servant's name and asked about their families. But years ago, an illness took away her hearing. At first, she thought it was temporary, but the doctors said it was permanent. Slowly, sound disappeared from her world. No voices, no music, no laughter, only silence. At first, her family tried to help. Arthur bought her the best hearing aids money could buy, but they didn't work. His wife, Madeline, hired nurses, but they came and went. People tried to talk to her, but when she couldn't understand, they gave up. One by one, everyone stopped trying. Margaret's world became small. Just her room, her memories, and her thoughts. She sat by the window most of the time, watching the garden where birds sang songs she could no longer hear. Sometimes she imagined their sounds, remembering how chirping once filled her mornings. When people passed her in the hallway, they smiled politely but never stopped to talk. Some whispered behind her back, thinking she couldn't understand, forgetting that even if she couldn't hear, she could still feel the weight of their silence. Arthur loved his mother deeply, but his life was busy. He was always traveling for business meetings, charity events, and media appearances. He told himself he was doing it all for her, to make her proud, but deep down he knew she didn't want money or fame. She just wanted to talk to her son again. Every time he visited her room, he would sit beside her, take her hand, and speak slowly, hoping she could read his lips. Sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't. When she didn't, she would just nod politely, pretending she understood. Arthur always left feeling helpless. He wanted to do something, but he didn't know how. Madeline, on the other hand, didn't have much patience. She respected her mother-in-law but didn't really try to connect with her. She was always busy organizing parties or managing charity galas. In her mind, Margaret was well taken care of. She had nurses, fine clothes, and all the comfort she needed. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. Margaret's loneliness was deep. The mansion that used to be full of laughter now felt like a cage. She often wrote in her notebook simple sentences like, "I miss my son," or "I wish someone would talk to me." Her handwriting was neat but shaky. Every day followed the same routine. A maid brought her breakfast at 8 a.m., then helped her dress. After that, Margaret would sit by the window for hours. At noon, she would move to the garden for some sunlight, and in the evening, she would sit quietly in her chair, watching old photographs. She couldn't hear the clock ticking, but she could see time passing. Sometimes she dreamed of her younger days, when Arthur was a little boy. He used to run to her, shouting, "Mama, look what I made." She would lift him up, laugh, and clap. Now she could see him only as a grown man, always in a hurry, always busy. She often wondered if he remembered how close they once were. Even the staff in the house treated her differently. They were kind but distant. They would bow slightly, smile, and move on. They didn't mean to ignore her, but they didn't know how to talk to her. To them, she was the quiet old lady who couldn't hear, harmless but unreachable. The only time she truly smiled was when she saw children in the garden, especially the young girl who sometimes came with the maid. Margaret didn't know her name yet, but she liked her face. The girl often looked at her curiously, not with pity but with warmth. It reminded her of something she had missed, genuine kindness. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her wheelchair near the rose bushes. The sun was soft and golden. The smell of flowers surrounded her. She saw 2 butterflies dancing near a bloom and smiled faintly. For a moment she felt peace. But then she looked around and realized she was alone again. The gardener had gone. The maids were inside. No one was there to share that beauty with her. She sighed and closed her eyes, letting the sunlight warm her face. In that stillness, she remembered her late husband. He had been her partner, her friend, the one who used to sign with her when her hearing started fading. Together, they had learned a few gestures to communicate. But after he passed away, no one else tried. The world became a quiet prison. That night, as she sat in her room, she picked up her notebook again and wrote, "People think silence is peaceful. It's not. It's heavy." She looked at the photo of her son and whispered, though she couldn't hear her own voice, "I just wish someone could understand me again." Little did she know someone already could. The next morning, as she rolled her chair toward the garden, she saw that same girl again, the maid's daughter, sitting with a book. Their eyes met. The girl smiled softly, not out of duty, but out of kindness. Margaret smiled back. Something about that smile felt different. It wasn't polite or forced. It was gentle, the kind that came from the heart. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a spark of hope. She didn't know why, but she felt that the silence in her world was about to break, and that the little maid's daughter might be the one to do it. That simple smile would soon lead to something no one in the Reynolds mansion could have imagined. A friendship that would change all of their lives forever. The next day was calm and sunny. The garden of the Reynolds mansion looked more beautiful than ever. The air smelled of fresh flowers, and the sound of the fountain filled the yard with soft splashes. Sounds that Margaret Reynolds could no longer hear, but still remembered in her heart. She sat near the roses, wrapped in a light shawl, watching the petals move gently in the breeze. The gardener greeted her with a smile before walking away, leaving her alone. It was nothing new. Silence had become her companion. Inside the house, the staff were busy as always. Clara, the maid, was polishing the grand staircase, and her daughter Lena waited quietly in the garden with her notebook. Lena had come to help her mother again that day, but her mind was somewhere else. Ever since she saw the old lady by the window last week, she couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something in Margaret's eyes, a deep sadness, but also warmth, the kind that made you want to reach out and comfort her. Lena looked up and saw her sitting alone again, staring at nothing. For a few seconds, she hesitated. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Don't get involved, Lena. Just stay quiet." But her heart whispered something different. "Go to her." Slowly, Lena stood up. Her heart beat faster with every step she took across the garden path. She didn't want to scare the old lady or disrespect anyone. She just wanted to say hello. When she reached the bench, Margaret looked up, surprised. No one ever came to her without being called. For a moment, they just looked at each other. One young and full of life, the other old and surrounded by silence. Lena smiled softly and pointed at the flowers, pretending to admire them. Margaret smiled back politely. But then, Lena did something no one in the mansion had ever done before. She lifted her hands and began to move them in sign language. At first, Margaret froze. She blinked several times, thinking she was imagining it. But then, she focused on Lena's hands, smooth, clear movements forming familiar shapes. Lena signed slowly, "Good morning. How are you?" For a second, Margaret didn't react. And then her eyes widened, and her lips trembled. She lifted her hands shakily and replied, You can sign. Lena nodded eagerly, smiling brightly. Yes, she signed back. Margaret's hands covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She hadn't spoken to anyone in sign language since her husband died years ago. No one in the house knew how. No one had ever even tried. And now this young girl, the maid's daughter, was signing perfectly, clearly, gently. Margaret signed again, her fingers trembling with excitement. What is your name? My name is Lena, the girl replied, her hands moving gracefully. You have a beautiful garden. Margaret laughed silently, a laugh that came straight from her heart. She signed back, Thank you, dear. I planted those roses myself, many years ago. For the first time in years, Margaret's face glowed with life. Her eyes sparkled. Her hands moved quickly now, as if they had been waiting forever to speak. She told Lena little things. How she used to love music, how she missed talking to her son, and how silence had become her world. Lena listened carefully, nodding, replying in signs that were clear and kind. She told Margaret that she had learned sign language when she was a child, because her father had been partly deaf before he passed away. She used to talk to him with her hands when words didn't work. When Margaret heard that, her expression softened. She reached out and gently held Lena's hand, squeezing it with gratitude. She signed, You must have a very good heart. Lena smiled shyly and signed back, I just wanted to talk to you. The two of them sat like that for nearly an hour, signing, smiling, sharing small stories. For everyone else, it might have looked like two people quietly sitting together, but for Margaret, it was magic. For the first time in so long, she wasn't trapped in silence. She was being heard. When a maid passed by and saw them, she couldn't believe her eyes. She ran inside to tell the others. Soon, whispers spread around the mansion. The maid's daughter is talking to Madame Margaret, with her hands. Even Clara, while dusting the library, heard the news and felt her heart stop. She hurried to the garden, worried her daughter might be in trouble. But when she reached there, she stopped at the sight. Margaret was laughing, really laughing, her eyes bright and full of joy. Lena was smiling too, signing happily. Clara had never seen the old woman so alive. When she turned to leave quietly, afraid of disturbing them, she saw Mr. Arthur standing behind her. He had just returned home and was watching from the doorway. Shocked, he whispered, She's smiling. Clara nodded, unsure what to say. Arthur took a few steps forward, his eyes full of surprise and emotion. He hadn't seen his mother this happy in years. Margaret noticed him, waved, and pointed at Lena proudly, signing something excitedly. Lena quickly turned and smiled shyly. Arthur didn't understand what they were saying, but he could feel it. Something special was happening. Later, when Lena and her mother were about to leave for the day, Margaret stopped them with a gesture. She signed, Will you come tomorrow? Lena nodded instantly. Yes, I will. Margaret reached for her hand again and mouthed the words slowly, Thank you. That night, Lena couldn't stop smiling. She told her mother how happy Mrs. Reynolds had been, and how they talked using sign language. Clara listened quietly, her eyes filling with tears. You did a beautiful thing, my child, she said softly. In her room, Margaret sat by her window holding a small notebook. For the first time in years, she didn't write sad thoughts. Instead, she wrote something new. Today, someone spoke to me in silence, and I heard love again. The mansion, once filled with emptiness, had finally found a voice again, through the gentle hands of a maid's daughter. The next morning, the Reynolds mansion was full of whispers. Something unusual had happened the day before, something no one had seen in years. The old Madame Margaret Reynolds, who was always quiet and distant, had been smiling. Some of the maids even said they saw her laughing in the garden with the maid's daughter, Lena. The staff couldn't stop talking about it. In the kitchen, while preparing breakfast, two maids whispered to each other. Did you hear? One said, placing dishes on the tray. The young girl, Clara's daughter. She was talking to Madame Margaret yesterday. How? Madame can't hear anyone, the other replied, raising an eyebrow. That's the strange part, the first maid said, lowering her voice. She wasn't talking with her mouth. She was using her hands. Everyone in the kitchen went silent for a moment. Then another worker asked softly, "You mean sign language?" The head cook, Mr. Jenkins, laughed. "You're joking. A maid's daughter knows sign language? Impossible." But as the morning went on, more and more people confirmed it. The gardener said he saw it with his own eyes. The butler said Madame Margaret had asked to sit outside again that morning, just to wait for the girl. When Clara arrived that day, she could feel the stares. The staff greeted her politely, but their eyes were full of curiosity. One of the maids smiled and said, "Your daughter must be very special, Clara. Madame seems happier than ever." Clara gave a shy smile but said nothing. Inside, she felt nervous. She hoped Lena hadn't caused any trouble. When she reached the garden, her worries faded. There was Margaret again, waiting near the same rose bushes, her face glowing with excitement. The moment Lena entered the garden, the old lady's eyes lit up like sunshine. She waved eagerly, motioning for the girl to come closer. Clara stood far back, watching as her daughter began signing again. Their hands moved gracefully, their faces full of emotion. Margaret laughed silently, her shoulders shaking. Lena smiled and nodded, listening carefully with her eyes. It was such a beautiful sight that even the maids who passed by stopped for a moment to look. Some smiled, others whispered, "I've never seen Madame like this," one of them said softly. "She looks 20 years younger," another replied. Word of the strange friendship spread quickly through the mansion, and soon, it reached the ears of Mrs. Madeline Reynolds, Arthur's wife. Madeline was sitting in the drawing room, reading a magazine, when her assistant entered. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "the staff is talking about Madame Margaret. They say she's been communicating with someone." Madeline raised an eyebrow. "Communicating? With who?" "With Clara's daughter, ma'am." Madeline frowned. "The maid's daughter?" She put her magazine down, slightly annoyed. "Since when do servants' children spend time with my mother-in-law?" She stood up and went to the window that overlooked the garden. There, she saw it for herself. Margaret smiling, her hands moving quickly in the air, and the young girl replying with equal energy. Madeline couldn't believe it. She called for Clara. "Clara, what is your daughter doing with Madame Margaret?" Clara bowed respectfully. "Madam, she only talks to her using sign language. Madame Margaret likes her company. They seem happy." "Sign language?" Madeline repeated, surprised. She didn't know what to think. Part of her was confused, another part was impressed. She had never seen her mother-in-law so joyful. That evening, when Mr. Arthur Reynolds came home, he heard the news too. His wife told him everything, and he immediately went to see his mother. When he entered her room, Margaret was sitting in her chair with a wide smile, something he hadn't seen in years. She looked up, saw him, and quickly began signing something. Arthur watched helplessly. He didn't understand a word. He felt frustrated again, like so many times before. Just then, Lena, who was helping Clara nearby, stepped forward. She hesitated but then said softly, "Sir, she's asking if you saw the flowers she planted today." Arthur blinked in surprise. "You can understand her?" Lena nodded. "Yes, sir. She's very happy today. She said she hasn't talked this much in a long time." Arthur looked at his mother again. Her eyes were shining with life. He turned back to Lena and said quietly, "Thank you for making her happy." That simple moment touched everyone who witnessed it. From that day on, Lena was no longer just the maid's daughter. People in the mansion began to treat her with respect. The maids smiled warmly when she walked by. The butler offered her tea. Even the head cook saved a sweet pastry for her sometimes. But not everyone was happy. Some of the older staff whispered that it wasn't proper for a servant's child to be so close to the family. "It's not her place," one said bitterly. "She'll get too comfortable." But those words faded quickly whenever people saw Margaret's smiling face. No one dared stop what was clearly doing so much good. Days passed, and the bond between Lena and Margaret grew stronger. They met every afternoon, sharing stories through their hands. Margaret told her about her youth, her late husband, and how much she missed hearing the sound of her son's laughter. Lena shared little stories about her school, her dreams, and her father, who had taught her sign language. They often laughed together, a quiet kind of laughter, but full of feeling. Even though one couldn't hear and the other had never known wealth, they understood each other perfectly. The staff began to notice small changes around the mansion. Margaret now came downstairs more often. She joined family dinners, something she hadn't done in years. She smiled at everyone, even the maids. She even began writing thank you notes for the workers who helped her. All of this made the Reynolds mansion feel alive again, less cold, more human. And everyone knew deep down that it all started because of Lena, the humble maid's daughter who spoke not with her voice, but with her heart. That night, when most of the staff had gone home, Clara looked at her daughter proudly. "You've changed something in this house, Lena," she said softly. "Something money never could." Lena smiled. "I just talked to her, Mama," she replied. "That's all." But both of them knew it wasn't just talking. It was understanding, the kind that could melt even the hardest walls of silence. And though the staff still whispered, this time, their words were filled with admiration, not gossip. The whole mansion could feel it. A new warmth spreading through its halls, one conversation at a time. The days in the Reynolds mansion began to change in a quiet but beautiful way. The air that once felt cold and heavy now carried a soft warmth. Every morning, Margaret Reynolds waited eagerly near the garden window, watching for a familiar face. Lena, the maid's daughter. It had become her favorite time of day. When Lena arrived, Margaret's whole face lit up with joy. They would sit together under the shade of the old oak tree, signing and smiling as if they were old friends. The laughter might have been silent, but the happiness was loud enough for everyone to feel it. At first, the Reynolds family didn't pay much attention. Arthur Reynolds, the billionaire, was always buried in his work. His wife, Madeline, was busy planning charity events and dinners. Their children were away in college. To them, Margaret was just the quiet old lady in the house. Someone they loved but didn't know how to reach anymore. But slowly, they began to notice small changes. Margaret started joining the family for breakfast again. She would greet the staff with a smile, something she hadn't done in years. She even began writing little notes for Arthur, short and sweet, like, "You look tired, my dear. Rest more." Arthur was touched. For a long time, his mother had seemed lost, locked inside her silence. Now she looked alive again. He didn't understand what had caused this change, but he was grateful. One evening, when Arthur returned home early, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. From the hallway window, he looked into the garden and saw his mother sitting with a young girl, Lena. They were moving their hands quickly, smiling and laughing without a sound. His mother looked radiant, her eyes shining like they did when he was a boy. Arthur quietly stepped outside and watched from a distance. For a few minutes, he didn't say a word. He just observed the scene in awe. The way his mother's face lit up, the gentleness in Lena's expressions. It was like watching a miracle. Finally, he walked closer. Margaret saw him and waved excitedly. Then she signed something to Lena, who turned to him with a shy smile. "She says she wants you to sit with us," Lena explained softly. Arthur smiled nervously. "I'd like that," he said and took a seat beside them. Margaret began signing again, her hands moving gracefully. Arthur watched helplessly. He couldn't understand a single sign. He looked at Lena, who gently translated. "She says she's happy today," Lena said. "She says she loves talking again." Arthur's throat tightened. He couldn't remember the last time his mother had said she was happy. "Tell her, I'm happy too," he said. Lena smiled and signed his message to Margaret. The old lady's face softened. She reached out and held her son's hand, her eyes full of love. That moment broke something inside Arthur. Not in a painful way, but in a healing one. He realized how far he had drifted from his mother, how much he had taken her silence for granted. Tears filled his eyes. Margaret noticed and wiped them away gently. She signed something again, and Lena interpreted softly. She says, "Don't cry. I understand. You were busy living. I was just waiting to be seen again. Arthur couldn't speak. He simply hugged his mother tightly. For the first time in years, he felt like her little boy again. Later that evening, during dinner, Arthur told his wife everything. "It's incredible, Madeline," he said with emotion in his voice. "Lena, Clara's daughter. She talks to my mother using sign language. She brought her back to life." Madeline was surprised but also thoughtful. "That girl? The maid's daughter?" she asked, slightly shocked. Arthur nodded. "Yes, you should have seen them together. Mother hasn't smiled like that in years." The next day, Madeline went to see it herself. She stood at the edge of the garden, watching from a distance. Lena was showing Margaret something with her hands, and the old woman was laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. The sight was so pure that even Madeline, who was used to controlling everything, felt her heart melt. When Lena noticed her standing there, she quickly stood up, nervous. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly. Madeline smiled politely. "Good morning, Lena. You know sign language?" "Yes, ma'am," Lena said. "My father was partially deaf. I learned it to talk to him." Madeline was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "You've done something wonderful for this family, Lena. Thank you." From that day, everything changed. Margaret insisted that Lena visit her every afternoon, and no one stopped her. The family even asked Lena to teach them a few basic signs. Arthur tried hard to learn how to say "I love you" and "Are you okay?" in sign language. It wasn't easy, but he wanted to try, for his mother. Sometimes, Margaret would tease him by signing too fast on purpose, and Lena would laugh softly, translating the jokes. The atmosphere in the house became lighter. Even the staff noticed it. There was laughter again, smiles again, and most importantly, love again. One evening, Margaret asked Lena to sit beside her. She took her hand and signed something gently. Lena smiled, but tears filled her eyes. She turned to Arthur and said, "She says she never thought she'd have another daughter, but now she feels like she does." Arthur's eyes softened. He looked at Lena with gratitude. "She's right," he said quietly. "You've become family." That night, Clara and Lena walked home under the stars. Clara held her daughter's hand tightly. "Do you know what you've done, my child?" she asked softly. "You gave a lonely woman her voice back. That's something no money can buy." Lena smiled. "She reminds me of Grandma," she said. "Sometimes, people just need someone to listen, even if it's without words." Back at the mansion, Margaret sat by her window, writing in her notebook again. But this time, there were no sad lines, no lonely wishes. Just one simple sentence written in neat, shaky handwriting. "Today, I spoke with my son, and I heard love again." The Reynolds mansion, once silent and cold, now had warmth in its walls. All because one brave girl cared enough to listen with her hands and speak with her heart. The next few days at the Reynolds mansion were filled with light and laughter. Everyone could see how happy Margaret had become, all because of Lena. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was part of their lives. But what no one really knew yet was the story behind Lena's beautiful gift. How she learned sign language, and what pain had once hidden behind her gentle smile. One afternoon, while Lena was helping Margaret water the flowers in the garden, Arthur came out to join them. He had been thinking a lot about Lena's kindness and how deeply she had touched his mother's life. He sat down on a nearby bench and watched as the two women moved their hands gracefully, talking in silence but full of emotion. After a while, he said softly, "Lena, can I ask you something?" Lena looked up, a bit nervous. "Of course, sir." He smiled. "You're very good at sign language. Did you learn it somewhere special?" Lena hesitated for a moment, her eyes lowering to the ground. "I learned it when I was very young," she said quietly. "My father was deaf. He lost his hearing in an accident before I was born. My mother always told me that he was the kindest man she had ever met." Arthur listened carefully, feeling a sudden ache in his chest. Lena continued, her voice trembling a little. "When I was a child, other kids used to make fun of my father. They would laugh when he tried to talk. It made me angry, but my father always smiled and said, People fear what they don't understand, my little one. So make them understand. She smiled faintly at the memory. So I decided to learn his language, the language of hands, eyes, and heart. My mother found some old books from the library, and we learned together. Every night after dinner, my father would teach me new signs. I still remember the first word he taught me. Love. Margaret watched her closely, her eyes full of tears. She gently touched Lena's hand, as if saying she understood completely. Lena continued softly. When I was about 10 years old, my father got very sick. The doctors said he wouldn't live long. Even when he couldn't speak, he used to sign to me, telling me stories, giving me advice. On his last day, he signed something I'll never forget. She paused, blinking back tears. He said, "Use your hands to help people who cannot speak, and use your heart to listen to those who cannot be heard." Arthur's throat tightened. There was so much wisdom and love in that simple message. After he passed away, Lena said, I promised myself I would never forget sign language. It's not just a skill for me. It's how I keep my father alive. The garden fell silent for a moment, except for the soft rustle of the wind. Even the flowers seemed to listen to her story. Arthur finally spoke, his voice gentle. Lena, your father would be proud. You didn't just keep his promise. You've changed someone else's life with it. Lena smiled shyly. I didn't expect any of this, sir. I just wanted to help your mother. She reminded me of my father. The same quiet eyes, the same loneliness. At that moment, Margaret reached out and took Lena's hands. She began to sign slowly, and Lena nodded, smiling through tears. Then she turned to Arthur and said, She says she feels like she's met an angel who speaks the language of her soul. Arthur felt his eyes grow moist. He looked at Lena and said quietly, You didn't just teach us sign language, Lena. You taught us love. Later that evening, as Lena helped her mother Clara clean the kitchen, Arthur walked in. Clara, he said gently, I want to thank you for raising such a wonderful daughter. Clara blushed slightly. Thank you, sir. Lena's always been a kind girl. She's had to grow up fast, but she's got her father's heart. Arthur nodded. I can see that. You've both done something incredible for my mother. She's alive again because of you. Clara smiled sadly. Sir, sometimes the smallest kindness can heal the deepest wounds. Your mother just needed someone to listen. And Lena knew how to listen without words. Arthur thought about that for a long moment. Then he said softly, From now on, Lena isn't just a maid's daughter in this house. She's someone special. Part of our family. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had worked in the Reynolds mansion for years, but no one had ever spoken to her with such warmth. Thank you, sir, she whispered. That means more than you can imagine. That night, Lena sat by her window, looking at the stars. She remembered her father's face, his patient smile, his strong hands moving in the air. She imagined him up there, watching her, proud and peaceful. Papa, she whispered, I did what you told me. I used my hands to help someone find their voice again. The next day, when Lena arrived at the mansion, she found something waiting for her on the front table. A small, beautifully wrapped box with her name on it. Inside was a silver bracelet with tiny engraved words. Hands that speak, heart that listens. There was a note, written by Arthur himself, for the girl who reminded us that love needs no sound. Lena held the bracelet close, tears falling down her cheeks. She had never received such a gift in her life, not because of pity, but because of respect. When she showed it to Margaret, the old woman smiled brightly and signed something sweet. Now you have a piece of us too. Lena nodded, smiling through happy tears. And you'll always have a piece of me. From that day onward, the bond between them grew stronger. Lena continued to visit every afternoon, teaching more sign language to the family, laughing and sharing stories. The mansion that once echoed with silence now felt alive, filled with love, gratitude, and gentle laughter. And though the world outside was loud and busy, inside those walls, they had discovered something far more beautiful, the quiet power of understanding. The Reynolds mansion had completely changed. Once a place filled with quiet formality and distance, it was now full of laughter, warmth, and life. Every afternoon, Lena came to visit Margaret, and together they signed, laughed, and shared stories. The staff had grown fond of watching them. One rich and elderly, the other young and humble, yet bound by something deeper than class or money. One bright morning, Arthur came to visit his mother in the garden. Margaret looked especially happy that day. She had written something in her notebook and waved it excitedly when Arthur sat beside her. Lena smiled and began to interpret for her. "She says she wants to go outside the house," Lena said. "She wants to visit the community center downtown, where people with hearing loss gather. She hasn't been there in years." Arthur was surprised. "Mother wants to go out? That's wonderful," he said. "We'll arrange everything." Within a few days, plans were made. Margaret would attend a charity event at the community center, a place she had supported many years ago before she lost her hearing completely. This time, however, she wasn't going alone. She wanted Lena to go with her. When the day finally came, the atmosphere was full of excitement. Margaret dressed elegantly in a blue gown, and Lena wore a simple but neat white dress. The moment they entered the center, people began whispering. Everyone recognized Margaret Reynolds, the billionaire's mother who had once been known for her grace and kindness, but who had disappeared from public life after her illness. Now she was back, smiling and radiant, walking hand in hand with a young girl no one knew. The event started with speeches, performances, and a few emotional stories from people who had overcome challenges with hearing loss. Margaret listened intently, her eyes shining with understanding. She signed comments to Lena, who replied softly, both of them communicating beautifully, while others watched in amazement. Finally, one of the event organizers approached Arthur and whispered something in his ear. Arthur nodded, smiled, and went up to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Many of you know my mother, Margaret Reynolds. For years, she's been silent. Not because she wanted to be, but because life made her that way. But recently, something wonderful happened." He paused and looked at Lena sitting beside his mother. "A young girl, Lena, the daughter of one of our staff, brought my mother's world back to life. Through sign language, through patience, through love, she helped my mother find her voice again." The audience gasped softly, touched by his words. Margaret smiled, proud and emotional. Arthur continued, "My mother would like to say something, and Lena will help her share it." Everyone fell silent as Margaret stood up. Her hands began to move gracefully, full of feeling and strength. Lena stood beside her, translating with a trembling voice. "My friends," Lena began, speaking for Margaret. "For a long time I lived in silence. I thought my world had ended when I lost my hearing. I thought I had nothing left to say. But then, someone spoke to me. Not with words, but with kindness." Margaret looked at Lena lovingly and continued signing. "This young girl reminded me that love doesn't need sound. Understanding doesn't need language. All it needs is a heart that listens." Lena's voice shook as she spoke the words. Many people in the audience wiped away tears. Margaret went on, signing faster now, her emotions strong. "Today, I want to start something new. A program that helps young people learn sign language, so that no one in silence ever feels alone again." The audience broke into applause. Arthur's eyes filled with tears. His mother, who once refused to leave her room, was now standing proudly before hundreds of people, inspiring them all. Reporters began snapping photos, and the story spread quickly. Billionaire's deaf mother returns to public life, with the help of a maid's daughter. The headlines read the next day. But what truly touched people's hearts was the photo of Margaret and Lena holding hands, smiling at each other, their bond shining brighter than any wealth or fame. Soon after, the Reynolds Foundation announced a new charity program, Hands of Hope, dedicated to teaching sign language to children and supporting families with hearing-impaired members. Arthur made sure that Lena's name was included as a co-founder. When Lena found out, she couldn't believe it. "Sir, I can't accept this," she said nervously. "I'm just an ordinary girl." Arthur smiled. You're not ordinary, Lena. You've done something that none of us could. You gave my mother her voice back. That makes you extraordinary. At the launch event for Hands of Hope, Margaret sat proudly in the front row, wearing the silver bracelet she had given Lena earlier. Lena stood on stage beside Arthur, nervous but excited. When it was her turn to speak, she looked out at the crowd and said in her gentle, simple way, "When I was little, my father told me that hands can speak and hearts can hear. I didn't understand it then, but now I do. Love is a language everyone can learn." The audience erupted in applause again. Even the children in the crowd began mimicking her signs for thank you and love. It was a sight that brought tears to everyone's eyes, especially Margaret's. After the event, a journalist approached Margaret and asked through an interpreter, "Mrs. Reynolds, what do you think of Lena?" Margaret smiled and signed slowly, "She is my voice." That short sentence appeared in every newspaper the next day. People across the city were inspired by the unlikely friendship between the maid's daughter and the billionaire's mother. Schools started including sign language workshops, and families began learning together. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky orange and gold, Margaret and Lena sat in the garden again, their favorite place. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was peaceful, filled with unspoken love and gratitude. Margaret signed one last message before going inside for the night. "You've changed more lives than you know." Lena smiled softly and signed back, "So have you." As the lights in the mansion glowed warmly through the windows, it was clear that the bond between them had become something rare and everlasting. Proof that sometimes, the simplest gestures can create miracles that echo far beyond words. Weeks passed after the Hands of Hope program was launched, and the Reynolds mansion was never the same again. What was once a place of silence had become a home full of meaning, laughter, and connection. Margaret had become a symbol of courage in the city, and Lena, the maid's daughter, was now known as the girl who brought light back into a billionaire's home. But for the two of them, fame didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they shared, something purer than anything the world could give. Every morning, Margaret woke up early, waiting by the garden window with her cup of tea. And right on time, Lena would arrive with her sweet smile and cheerful good morning. She would sit beside Margaret, and together they would talk in the language that connected their hearts, sign language. Sometimes they would laugh at simple things, like the birds fighting over crumbs or the gardener's clumsy steps. Sometimes they would talk about deep things, life, love, and memories. Margaret would tell stories of her younger days, and Lena would share stories about her father. One quiet afternoon, Margaret sat by the window, watching the sunlight dance on the flowers. She turned to Lena and signed slowly, "I used to think my silence was a curse, but now I see it was a bridge, a way to find you." Lena smiled warmly. "And I used to think being poor was a curse," she replied softly, "but it brought me here to you." They both laughed gently, feeling the truth in each other's words. As the days went by, Lena continued helping with the Hands of Hope program. She started teaching children sign language at the local community center. The kids adored her because she made learning fun. She taught with stories, songs, and laughter. Margaret sometimes joined her too, sitting proudly in the front row, cheering the children on with her expressive signs. One day, during one of these sessions, a little girl ran up to Lena and hugged her tightly. "I taught my grandma how to say, 'I love you' in sign," she said excitedly. Lena smiled and looked at Margaret, who had tears in her eyes. That moment showed them that their small effort had begun to change lives, not just their own but many others. But one morning, when Lena arrived at the mansion, she noticed something different. The house was unusually quiet. Clara, her mother, met her at the door with a serious face. "Lena," she said softly, "Mrs. Reynolds isn't feeling well today. She's resting in her room." Lena's heart sank. She rushed to Margaret's room and found her sitting on her bed, looking pale but peaceful. Still, when she saw Lena, she smiled warmly. Margaret signed weakly, "Don't look so worried, my dear. I'm just a little tired." Lena sat beside her, holding her hand. "You should rest," she said gently. Margaret nodded. I will. But there's something I want to tell you. She reached for her notebook and began to write slowly. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes were steady. When she finished, she handed the paper to Lena. It said, "If one day you don't find me here, don't be sad. You have to keep doing what we started. Promise me you'll keep teaching, keep spreading love, and keep listening, even when there's silence." Tears filled Lena's eyes. She nodded quickly, signing back, "I promise." Margaret smiled and gently touched her face. "Good girl," she signed. "You've been my voice and my peace." That night, Margaret fell asleep with a soft smile on her face. The next morning, she didn't wake up. She had passed away quietly in her sleep, calm, at peace, and loved. The mansion was filled with sorrow, but it was not a painful silence this time. It was a silence filled with gratitude and beautiful memories. Arthur was heartbroken but thankful that his mother had spent her last months full of joy. During the funeral, people from everywhere came to pay their respects. Many from the deaf community attended, signing messages of love and remembrance. On the front row, Lena sat beside her mother, holding the bracelet Margaret had given her. When it was Lena's turn to speak, she walked slowly to the front. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. "Mrs. Reynolds taught me that love doesn't need words," she said softly. "She showed me that even in silence, the heart can speak louder than anything else. She wasn't just a rich woman. She was a kind soul who gave me a second family. I'll carry her lessons forever." Everyone in the hall was moved to tears. Even Arthur, standing beside his children, couldn't hide his emotions. After the ceremony, he walked up to Lena and said, "My mother loved you like her own, and so do we. From now on, you'll always have a place in our family." Years later, Hands of Hope became one of the most successful charity programs in the country. Thousands of children and adults learned sign language because of it. In front of the main building, there stood a statue, two hands gently touching, one young and one old. At the base, engraved in simple letters, were the words, "Love needs no sound." Lena continued her work, traveling to schools, hospitals, and communities. She taught people that silence wasn't emptiness, it was another way of speaking. And every time she looked up at the sky, she whispered softly, "We did it, Mrs. Reynolds." Sometimes, when the wind blew gently through the trees, Lena could almost feel Margaret's presence, a warm, silent comfort wrapping around her. One evening, as Lena finished a class with her students, a little boy signed to her, "Who taught you to do this?" Lena smiled, her eyes shining. "An angel who couldn't hear but taught me how to listen," she replied. The boy smiled, not fully understanding, but feeling the love behind her words. As the sun set, painting the sky in golden colors, Lena looked up and smiled. She knew that even though people leave, their kindness never does. It stays, in the lives they touch, in the hearts they heal, and in the silence that still speaks love. And somewhere beyond the clouds, Margaret Reynolds was smiling too, proud of the girl who had turned her silence into a symphony of hope.